all those who appreciate the work that we're doing here on Standing for Truth, please hit that subscribe button because we are just getting started. All right, guys, it looks like we are live and we've already got a great audience tonight. Thank you so much for your patience. This is going to be a fun one. We've got Jefferson here as well as Gavin. And the topic of the night is authorship and dating of the four gospels. So this is going to be lots of fun. This is certainly a great topic. Now, real quick before we go into some introductions from the debaters tonight. First of all, I want to thank them both for giving us their time for this important topic and debate. Announcement wise, though, next week we've got a couple good shows on Thursday. We've got Joseph Hubbard. He's going to be back here. We're going to be taking audience questions. So it's going to be a rapid fire Q&A. And on the Friday, we've got round 2 between the Neffs. David Neff versus Nephilim Free on the global flood. So it's the sequel. That's going to be a lot of fun. And the first week of March, we've got Matt Slick back on, who is going to be debating Derek Barnes on secular morality versus Christian morality. So that's definitely going to be a lot of fun as well. Anyways, guys, please make sure you're tagging me at Standing for Truth with your questions. That way I can see them for a Q&A. Following the debate. So anyways, enough from me. Let's hand it over to the debaters. We've got Jefferson and Gavin. This is Jefferson's first time on the channel. So why don't we start with you, Jefferson? Thanks so much for being here. Why don't you give us a brief introduction, who you are, what's going on over at your channel, what should we expect to find if we check you out on YouTube, so on and so forth. So Jefferson, thanks for being here. You are on mute, so just make sure you unmute yourself and we'll be good to go. Jefferson, thanks again.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Thanks, Gavin, for asking me to do the debate. My channel is pretty casual. I've done a couple of, I think maybe 1 or 2 interviews, but they've been, fairly short and sweet. Mostly I kind of lurk around in other people's channels and stuff, and I do, occasional rants and things like that. Nothing big, but yeah, it's great to be on. Thanks again.
Awesome. Well, I'm excited. Thanks again. Gavin, good to have you on again. You're no stranger, of course, to debates. Both of you, no strangers to debates. So that's why it's going to be a lot of fun. Gavin, thanks again. Brief introduction.
Shalom. Are you hearing me standing?
Yes. Now you sound good. We can hear you.
Okay. That's fine. Test. 1, 2, 3.
Yep. You sound good, Gavin. You sound good. How you doing tonight?
I'm keen. Let's rumble. Let's get ready to rumble.
Okay. Well, we're good to go. So why don't we, thanks for the introductions, gentlemen. Format for the night. We're going to have a roughly 10 to 12 minute opening statement, followed by a cross-examination from both debaters, of course, and then an open dialogue where we're going to keep it as usual. We like to keep it as professional as possible on this channel, cordial, respectful, as equally timed as possible, and sticking to the topic at hand, hopefully one topic at a time until we exhaust the topic of the debate. We'll move into some concluding statements and an audience Q&A. So make sure that you're tagging me. Anyways, we're going to be starting with Gavin. Since he's kind of in the affirmative today, he's the theist. So Gavin, whenever you are ready, you've got 10 to 12 minutes. I'll start the clock on your first word.
Ting, ting, let's go. So it's important from the very outset to establish what this debate is not about. The debate is not about whether or not God exists, and it's not about whether the Bible is true or not. That the original autographs of the Gospels were anonymous, that's not news to anybody. However, the original autographs of the following works were also anonymous. This is the original autographs: Aristotle's Poetics, Plato's Republic, Aristophanes' Birds, Livy's The Early History of Rome, Tacitus, The Annals of Imperial Rome, Shakespeare's Hamlet, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, Kant's Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics, and C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. The original autographs, the original books, weren't authored, or they didn't have the author's name attached to them. So the original Gospels are no more. They're lost to time, because time is the enemy of parchment and ink. However, we've got copies for Africa. So first of all, what do scholars do to determine the genuineness of an ancient text like the Gospels? So the argument I will be using is going to be the same criteria that historians use for any historical document. I'll be using external sources. I won't be using the Bible. I will use what's called attributions of authorship. I will use early use of other works, integration with other historical sources, overall consistency, and other internal marks of authenticity, in brackets, e.g. the fingerprints of the author. So, in establishing the authorship of an ancient work, the testimony of those who attribute the work to a particular author provides very important historical evidence. Very important historical evidence. When others who are in a position to know, claim that the author attached to the extant manuscript wrote that work, it is strong evidence of authorship. It's strong evidence of authorship. These people are in a position to know if they lived at the same time, knew people who lived at the same time, or referred to the testimony of people who lived at the same time. The early church leaders referred by Christians as the early church fathers fit this description perfectly. They made many references to the authors of the New Testament Gospels in their writings. Eusebius, the church historian from the early 4th century, gives us the names of three of these church fathers, Polycarp, Papias, and Ignatius. Historians have given Ignatius' death as a martyr as occurring around 110 AD. So we can date these Christian leaders as ministering around this time. This is early. This is really early for a text of antiquity. If John the Apostle died in the 90s, as everybody concedes he did, then it's not surprising that these leaders knew John the Apostle either personally or knew those who knew him personally. So once it can be established that disciples contemporaneous with Jesus wrote the Gospels, then we know that the Gospels were published in the lifetime of those disciples, and in the same generation as Jesus himself, and in the same generation of those who saw Jesus alive and well after he'd been seriously dead for 3 days. Imagine that. They were written and published, therefore, in the 1st century. The exact dates cannot be established, but that's not really a big deal, and I'll explain that later. The exact dating is not a huge deal, because we can give a general time period in terms of decades, indicating the historical evidence. The authors of the Gospel and the general time periods when the Gospels were published were known by the early church. However, their focus was always on the authorship of the text, not the date they were written. We will begin with the Synoptic Gospels and then move on to John. The dates of the Synoptic Gospels will be generally established by the connection with Peter and Paul's ministry in Rome and the subsequent death of these apostles at the hands of Emperor Nero. So, based on the testimony of the church fathers, Ignatius, Papias, Polycarp, If you're interested in when they were born and when they were died, Polycarp was born in 69, Papias was born in 70. There's no birth date for Ignatius, but he was martyred in 108 AD. So, based on the testimony of these church fathers, Matthew most likely issued his gospel originally in the Hebrew dialect in the 50s for the Jewish Christians in Israel, while Peter was in Rome ministering, and then later sometime in the late 50s or early 60s, he wrote his Greek version while Peter and Paul were still in Rome ministering. Then Mark published the private edition of his gospel for the church at Rome after Matthew's. Luke then published his gospel. Mark then published a public edition of his gospel for the churches at large, which was published after Peter and Paul subsequently left Rome. Later, while John was living in Ephesus, possibly in the late 80s or early 90s, he published his gospel. Peter was in Rome in the 50s, preaching and founding the church. Paul came to Rome in the early 60s as a prisoner. He came as a prisoner to Rome. Peter and Paul preached together in Rome, but probably only for a short time and only during the early 60s. They often traveled to and fro from Rome because they were itinerant preachers. Luke and Mark were also in Rome in the 60s AD with Paul and Peter. Eusebius writes that Peter came to Rome during the reign of Claudius to defend the faith against a heretic called Simon Magnus. The reign of Claudius was from 41 to 54. So Peter probably came to Rome in the very early 50s. He certainly went to Rome after the Jerusalem Council, which was in 50 AD. Justin Martyr, in his first apology, 26, also writes of the heretic Simon Magnus coming to Rome during the reign of Claudius. If Peter came to Rome when Claudius was emperor, it was most likely in the early 50s, as I've said. The apostles were, by nature of their ministry, travelers constantly going on missionary journeys, no matter where they settled. So Peter would not have stayed in Rome the whole time, but he would have used Rome as like a base, an operations base. Most scholars estimate that Paul came to Rome around 60 as a prisoner. This approximate date is based on his interaction with the procurators in the book of Acts, and Acts chapter 24, verse 27. Paul first appears before Antonius Felix, the Roman procurator, and it is confirmed for the last 2 years of Felix's procuratorship. Then Porcius Festus takes over as procurator, and Paul is brought before him soon after he takes office. Paul appeals to Caesar, which gives Paul the right to plead his case before the emperor as a Roman citizen. He set sail for Rome in the first few months of Festus's reign. Since Festus was procurator from circa 59 until his death in 62, Paul was most likely sent to Rome in 59 or 60. Eusebius also writes in his work Church History 2.25.1, 5 verses 5 through 8, that Peter and Paul were martyred in Rome under the Emperor Nero. So Nero reigned from 54 to 68. Most scholars agree that Nero's persecution of the church began when Nero burned Rome and blamed the Christians in 64. From Eusebius, we also learn that Peter and Paul were martyred during the persecution that broke out in 64. Peter and Paul were martyred when the persecution broke out in 64. So most likely, Matthew issued his gospel originally in the Hebrew dialect in the 50s for the Jewish Christians in Israel while Peter was in Rome ministering, and then sometime in the late 50s or early 60s, he wrote his Greek version while Peter and Paul was still ministering in Rome. Then Mark published his gospel after Matthew's. When Peter returned to Rome, he gave approval for a public edition of the gospel for the churches at large, which was published after Peter and Paul subsequently left Rome or they had been martyred. Irenaeus then states that Luke wrote his gospel. As we've seen, this is in agreement with the early evidence that Luke was published after the private edition of Mark's gospel, but before the public edition. Almost finished. So as we've seen from Irenaeus' statement, synthesized with the other evidence from the early church fathers, Matthew's Hebrew version was published in the late 50s published in the 50s, not late 50s, published in the 50s, mid 50s. With the Greek version being published in the late 50s, but no later than the early 60s. Mark and Luke were also published in the 60s. Irenaeus does not tell us exactly when John's gospel was published, but he does tell us that it was published when John was a resident in Ephesus. Irenaeus mentions the general time period of John's death in his work Against Heresies 3.3.5. So from there, we can make an educated guess of sometime between 80 and 99 AD. John was in Jerusalem at least up until the
20 seconds.
Jerusalem. Sorry?
You've got 20 seconds, Gavin.
Yeah, I'm almost there.
No problem.
Yeah. So John was in Jerusalem at least until the Jerusalem Council, and he probably left Jerusalem sometime in the 60s. So his gospel was likely written after 70. The gospel had to be written before John died. John died during the reign of Trajan, who ruled from 98 to 117. This gives us a window of 70 AD to 99 AD. However, the gospel had to be written long enough after the fall of the temple in Jerusalem so that John doesn't even bother mentioning it. Perhaps it was a decade or more. So sometime between 80 and 99 is probable. Isolating the exact date is not that important. What is important is that it was written by an apostle in the generation of the life of Jesus and the eyewitnesses of Jesus. So in conclusion, the historical literary evidence can establish the general time periods of the publishing of the Gospels. However, establishing the dates is not a big deal. It's not a deal breaker. It's not as important as establishing who the authors were. Once the authors are established, then we know it was written in their lifetimes. And that is the critical code red or code blue information we need. The early church seemed unconcerned about dates and only concerned with the authorship. That is what was important to the early church, and it's also what is important to us today as followers of Christ. The four Gospels were collected by the church in the first century because they were written by the apostles Matthew and John, and by Mark, the close associate and amanuensis of Peter, and by Luke, the first century physician who was a close associate and traveling companion of Paul. Finally, no other gospel was collected because no other gospel or close associate of an apostle wrote a gospel in the first century. All other works which have been discovered in air quotes, came in the second century, far too late to be written by an apostle or even a close associate of an apostle. They were never accepted by the
Gavin, you got to start wrapping it up, my good man. We're now over 13 minutes.
Your last sentence. They were never accepted by the early church fathers and the apostolic churches because they were not written by apostles or any close associates of apostles. And with that, I yield my time. Apologies.
I don't know if there's any time to yield. I'm just kidding. So, hey, no problem. Listen, we're easy going here, and this is going to be a fun debate, cordial. But to be fair, Jefferson, Gavin went just over 13 minutes. Therefore, take as much time as you need. We're going to give you equal time for your opening statement. And whatever time you don't use, if you don't use the full 13 minutes, we'll just toss that into the dialogue portion. So, Jefferson, the floor is yours. Whenever you're good to go, I'll start your timer.
Okay. Yeah, so I was just going to start out with this because mostly what I'm going to be arguing is just kind of the scholarly consensus view as far as when we had originally talked about this debate. I thought the emphasis was going to be more on the dating, but it doesn't matter. I mean, if Gavin has shifted the debate over to the authorship, that's fine too. But I think one of the things that gets kind of tricky, you really can't. He's right. You can't talk about the dating of them without talking about the authorship, because the dating is kind of important if you want to assert certain things about those authors. So I guess I'll start out with this. The scholarly consensus view in general begins with the study of the synoptic problem. So laying out the synoptic gospels for anybody in the audience that's unaware, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are considered the synoptic gospels because they can be laid out side by side. Synoptic is seen together, and they can tell in the original Greek that Matthew and Luke have whole sections that match Mark and vice versa. So it's a major source of Christian scholarship. There's lots of people that work on it. It's not settled, but as far as the consensus view goes, based on what's being borrowed where and what kind of changes are happening and what kind of things are being kept exactly the same, most of the consensus sides with the fact that it's called Mark in priority, that Mark must have been written first. And then Matthew and Luke followed up shortly afterward, and they were able to, they have some original material on their own, and plus they supposedly borrow from a Q source or something like that. And then John follows afterward. John is, there's a reason it's not a synoptic gospel. It actually has something of a completely separate, well, almost completely separate theological tradition. It's running parallel with kind of the evangelical messages that are happening in the synoptic gospels. So the one thing that we know when we're dating it, that Jesus was executed in and around 30 CE. So the gospels had to be written sometime after that. In terms of trying to rein it in on the other end, like how late could they have been written? Well, we know that around 180 CE, Irenaeus names the gospels. He doesn't name them, but he actually, in a writing, he mentions the apostles and the authors' names attributed to him. Scholars aren't certain if he's the one responsible for attributing those names, but they just know that he's mentioned them. Around 150 CE, Justin Martyr mentions that he's acquainted with the Gospels, but he doesn't refer to them as the Gospels. They're referred by a different name. It's not generally understood if he was aware of all of them or some of them, but they believe that he was probably familiar with most of them. So that's 150. Also around 150 CE, there was a guy named Marcion who was roaming around, had his own kind of docetic view of Christianity, and he had a gospel that began to circulate in 150 CE that is a redacted version of the Gospel of Luke. So Luke obviously comes before that one, and Luke's probably one of the later ones. So we can narrow it down to 30 to 150. I believe it's in the letters from Polycarp, and there was another guy that appear around 110, 115, where they mention the names of the Gospels. So we can narrow it down there. So most of the stuff is probably going to be pushed back in there. The real trick is whether or not how soon after Jesus was executed was a gospel written. Dating as far as like the epistles of Paul, we know those came first. Geographically, Paul starts writing probably around the late 40s into the 50s, and that's sort of the extent of his career. A lot of scholars do believe that he was probably, it's part of the church tradition that he was likely martyred towards the end of Nero's reign in the late 60s. But so most of his career probably starts late 40s, goes into the 60s, late 60s. That's kind of the extent of his entire missionary career. Based on the way he's writing, it doesn't seem like he was a very well-traveled, his mission was extremely well-traveled. He does not ever really mention any of the Gospels. And given all of the churches that he went and traveled to, it seems like during his travels, he should have become acquainted with at least one of the earliest ones, if it had been written around the time that he was around then. But he usually, when Paul is referring to scriptures, he's always referring to the Septuagint, right? The Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. So once we start getting it narrowed down to that, we start getting into things like issues that pop up in Mark. So if the scholars have kind of decided that the earliest one, due to the synoptic problem, should be Mark and everything else is coming secondary to him, there's things that Mark writes about that seem to hit on events that he should have known about, the author should have been aware of, specifically the Roman siege of Jerusalem and a little bit of the civil war that was happening within the walls during the siege, and then the destruction of the temple. Those happened around 70 CE. That particular portion of it, more than likely, he's actually writing in Mark chapter 13. Jesus gives a kind of prophecy about that upcoming disaster. But then he also later on gives another prophecy where he says that people will see him return before their lives have ended. He will be returning within the lifetimes of the people that are hearing him talk then. Obviously, that prophecy doesn't come true. But if the other one did, it's that's a true prophecy. So it seems to most scholars that this is an invention of the author that's being put in there, and it's somebody who is writing during that time, maybe a little bit after. It's also likely that the manuscripts that we do have were written in Greek. It was probably written by a Greek-speaking and writing Christian, relatively well-educated, enough to be able to do Greek composition. Probably was not a native of Palestine, because there's certain things that the author of Mark gets wrong about. There's some geography fumbles, plus there's some issues with his knowledge of Judaism, the role of the Pharisees, things like that. So that's sort of the stage of the dating. So that's why for most everybody, the consensus scholarship range puts it between all of the Gospels between 70 and about 150, 120 CE. Usually within that range, and in the order of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and then John, and then Acts was probably written shortly after Luke. One of the other things that occurs with this is sort of the dating of John. John is the one that is the most blatant in terms of referring to Jesus as a divinity, whereas the Synoptic Gospels are a little bit cagier about that. Maybe with the exception of Luke. Luke kind of goes nuts with his Christology. We'll probably get into that a little bit later. But John seems to most scholars to be representative of a parallel Christian tradition, separate but parallel theological tradition that might have been happening at the same time. And some of the traditions and some of the theological ideas that are coming out of John are different. Dating that one is a little bit trickier, but for the most part, some of the methods that it brings up and the sort of accepted divinity of Christ seems to be a later settled theological evolution. If you're tracking sort of the oral tradition that must have been happening right after Christ's death to the writing of the first Gospels. So there's probably anywhere from a 30 to 40 year gap following Jesus's death. What ends up happening in terms of how that really affects who could have written them, they likely weren't written by eyewitnesses, but that doesn't mean that the authors didn't have access to some eyewitnesses or some eyewitness testimony in some ways. In fact, Luke even mentions that he had access to documents and stuff that he perused. He mentions it in Luke 1. But the problem with this is that we don't have, Jesus would have been ministering to people in Aramaic, and the disciples his apostles that he collected were from that region. They would have spoken Aramaic. It's very unlikely that they would have written Greek. They may have spoken a little bit, but being able to speak a language just a little bit secondhand and knowing how to do a composition in that language are two very different, tasks. So what's happened, at least in terms of the way these were written, it probably wasn't any of the original apostles, because they would have had to have met sometime right after Christ's death, sort of quote unquote gone to Greek school or something. And this likely was not something that was done back then. As far as, in fact, there's actually a professor named Christina Hesher who does studies on literacy in the ancient world. And her study, she did research on projected estimates for literacy in this period of time in the Levant and the Palestine region, and kind of has a figure of about 3% literacy for the total population. Very unlikely that you had a lot of people in Jesus's group that had any ability to compose something in Greek. The other thing is that it doesn't seem like most of the writers of the four Gospels are natives to Palestine. They're knowledgeable in Greek rhetoric, and they probably exist somewhere else. In the ancient world, they're living in different churches. So that portion of it as well, that the idea that they're collecting, like the author of Luke is saying that he's collecting statements, that he's collected these reports and things like this, is evidence right from the scriptures that these writers were not eyewitnesses themselves. They were reporting on stories and were collecting different tales in an oral tradition and kind of bringing them together. There's also the fact that a lot of the Gospels have they have theological and Christological elements that can't totally be reconciled. And if you try to reconcile them, it's, through harmonization, you actually kind of end up blunting the individual messages that they're given. Specifically, if you're trying to like harmonize the way Mark is dealing with the idea that Jesus is a secret Messiah versus John, he's definitely the Messiah and the Messiah is divine. So there's a big difference between those. So that's kind of basically why why the scholarly consensus view is kind of settled in that date range between 70 CE and 115 and 120. For me, and for purposes of probably this debate, we'll get into it later on. My issue with it, to me, it's not that important what the exact dating is, and no scholar is going to give an exact date for the original writings, right? Because anything that we have copies of copies. And those can be roughly dated, but we know that they probably happened. The copies that we have that still survive, even the fragments, probably post-date the original compositions by quite a bit. But the issue comes about when a lot of Christians run with the assumptions that they get from churches, where churches tell people Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote those stories, and those four individuals were there. They were original apostles from this Aramaic-speaking area. And they're responsible for this. If they get any pushback, they might say, "Well, no, it was written. They could have been written by amanuensis." These kind of scholar kinds of things. That's a little far-fetched as well. It doesn't seem likely that these particular individuals would either be traveling with scholars that would act as scribes for them, because normally scribe services were reserved for the wealthy. And also, if they were somehow later on trying to pursue an education so they could become scribes themselves, that likely didn't happen either, because that education would have started when they were much younger in life. And most of these people were laborers, fishermen, this kind of thing. So that's sort of where I'm at with it. I think that kind of gives a really brief, very general rundown of scholarly consensus on both of those issues. But obviously, they both get very, very detailed. There's lots of books written about these. So, and with that, I'll yield my time.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jefferson. Thanks to the both of you for those opening statements. About a minute to spare, Jefferson, so I'm going to throw that into the discussion portion. We got a great chat tonight, very lively, lots of good people. Guys, please tag me with your questions. I'll start saving them so we can have a bit of a Q&A when we're done here with the dialogue and concluding statements. So we're moving into the cross-examination portion of the debate, guys. Let's keep this on topic. Let's keep this professional, attacking the arguments, of course, and not the person. So looks like we're going to be starting with Gavin. Since Jefferson just ended, I imagine Gavin is now going to cross-examine Jefferson. I think we're going to do 10-minute rounds. After you each cross-examine each other once, we'll go into the open discussion from my understanding. So Gavin, Jefferson, both you gentlemen are on mute. So the floor is yours. Gavin, you can start asking the questions. I'll start the timer. Just make sure you unmute yourselves, and we're good to go. We're good to go. Yeah, you sounded a little. You sound good. A little bit distant.
Okay, I can lean forward. Hold on.
I think we're good. It's just the nature of your camera probably being a little bit far from you, but I think we're good. If there's any audio issues or Jefferson's having a hard time hearing you, Jefferson, just let us know and we can do something to fix that. So anyways, guys, the floor is yours. I'll put the timer on your first question, Gavin.
Okay, so 10-minute cross-examination. So Jefferson, I keep hearing this phrase, the scholarly consensus, the consensus of scholars. Can you name the scholars that you're citing?
Yes, I can.
And they are?
Well, I have the two sources that I sent to Standing for Truth include the study Bible and one of the textbooks that I've been using for my own study for the past couple months. I could start listing a bunch of people if you want to do that, but those scholars are listed in there, not only for the kind of traditional one, but there's a few sources in there where they bring up some of the older issues, like the Hebrew the Hebrew gospel hypothesis for Matthew,
Okay,
which
so you're
doesn't
talking
hold there.
about scholarly consensus, and yet you've only provided two sources, correct?
No, I've provided two sources that contain dozens of sources, hundreds of sources. So, I mean, if you just want me to start...
No. That's not how it works. That's not how it works. If you provided two sources, then that is what you call a scholarly consensus, and that doesn't cut it, I'm sorry.
No, I provided two sources that have many sources in them.
4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23 New Testament scholars. I have provided 23 New Testament scholars. That sounds more like a scholarly consensus than just two, doesn't it?
I didn't say I only had two scholars. I said I cited two sources that contain lots of scholarly sources. I just didn't list them all because, first of all, I've read excerpts of them. They're included in the...
That's enough. That's pretty weak. Pretty weak. You also
okay, but you're... Hang on. If you could, just a question, could you provide that list?
This is my cross-examination. My cross-examination. You need to be quiet and just answer questions. Are we clear?
I don't get to ask clarifying questions. Is that something that you're okay with, standing for truth?
You're not going to play those atheist tricks in this debate. In the cross-examination, I ask questions, you answer. Now, Q as a source.
Actually, I'm gonna jump in real quick because I stopped the timer. Yeah, we will reduce crosstalk just so everybody can hear what everybody's saying. If Gavin does ask a question, or if Jefferson asks a question during his time, and maybe a clarification is necessary, I think we'll allow that. Might make sense. But anyways, it's going good so far. I'm sorry to jump in. I'll start the timer again. We'll start fresh. Gavin, go ahead, ask your question. And yeah, go ahead, gentlemen.
Sure. So, Jefferson, you cited Q, the Gospel of Q, as a source, correct?
I'm sorry, I couldn't make out that last part.
You cited the Q Gospel as a source, correct?
Yeah, for the Synoptic Gospels, yes.
Okay. The Q source is only utilized by atheists and non-theists. There's no New Testament scholar that takes any notice of the Q source. So that was a bad argument. You also talked a lot about the disciples and Jesus not being able to speak Greek or read Greek or talk Greek. Is that right?
No, write Greek.
Write Greek. You made the assumption that Jesus and the disciples could not write Greek, correct?
That's not my assumption. That's scholarly consensus.
Well, again, you've only provided two scholars, so it's a pretty weak consensus.
That's inaccurate. I provided more than two scholars.
So how do you know that Jesus and the disciples were illiterate when it came to speaking Greek, writing Greek, or reading Greek?
Well, scholars don't know for certain. It's just a best estimate based on what they know about the culture at the time, rates of literacy that they can predict, and the fact that Aramaic was the primary spoken language. And most of those individuals wouldn't have had any kind of Greek education for the jobs that they were doing. So,
wow. Well, I'm glad you stepped on that mine. Here's the big shock for you. Were all Jews living in the time of Jesus illiterate peasants? ? What skeptics and atheists often acknowledge. What skeptics and atheists don't often acknowledge is that the Mishnah and the Dead Sea Scrolls show some Jews taught their kids to read and write. In fact, the Mishnah shows that they even encouraged girls to learn Greek. Imagine that, Jefferson. After the war with Rome, the Mishnah records some directions saying not to teach kids Greek, but this tips us off to the fact that some people were in fact teaching Jewish kids Greek. It seems to square with the Gospels. Over 60 times, Jesus asked the Pharisees and Sadducees and others, "Have you not read?" Clearly, Jewish scribes could read and write Greek too. So isn't it true that So it isn't true. Sorry, it isn't true that all the Jews, particularly the disciples and Jesus in Galilee, were illiterate when it came to Greek.
No,
But anyway, let's talk about you don't talk. You get your chance coming up, okay? You don't talk.
Is there going to be a question?
What about Jesus' disciples? Were all of Jesus's disciples illiterate to Greek? No. Some of Jesus' disciples.
Well, real quick, I'm just going to jump in, Gavin. I'm pausing the timer. Let's do this for the examination rounds. Let's try and get to the question as quickly as possible, and then when we get to the dialogue portion, then maybe we can take our time a little bit more. So if you do have a question for Jefferson, Gavin, maybe you want to get to it, just because we've only got a few minutes left for this particular round. But go ahead, gentlemen. I paused the timer, so no worries. We're not wasting time. Go ahead, Gavin, with your question for Jefferson.
Okay, so where do you get the speculation that Jesus and his disciples could not read, write, or speak Greek? Because the Bible is absolutely silent about them speaking, reading, or writing Greek. So you're speculating.
I'm presenting the scholarly consensus.
An argument from ignorance.
It isn't. It's the scholarly consensus at this time.
No, I don't think so. Two scholars citing two scholars is not a consensus.
I already told you I cited more than that. I cited two sources that contain lots of scholars within them. You keep getting that wrong.
Well, I'm not interested in claims, Jefferson. I'm not interested in claims.
These are not claims. It's scholarly consensus.
I want to see your evidence. I'm not interested in claims. Claims are as common as nostril hairs. Everyone's got them, but they're not worth much. So, let's see. So you're committing the argument from ignorance regarding Jesus and the disciples speaking, reading, or writing Greek. You mentioned that Luke and Mark were not eyewitnesses. That's common knowledge. So why did you mention that?
I mentioned that none of the four authors of the Gospels were eyewitnesses, according to scholarly consensus.
No. You've got to stop saying this according to scholarly consensus.
Why? I already said I started.
I have provided you with 23 New Testament scholars.
You didn't provide those to me.
You have provided two.
You didn't. You have not provided me a list of your sources.
They're in the video description.
Oh, okay.
Oh, okay.
They weren't before, so.
They weren't before. So thanks for wasting my time. So why did you say that Luke and Mark were not eyewitnesses when that's common knowledge?
Hang on a second. I don't see any. There's nothing in the description showing your sources. So
he's wasting my time. He's wasting my.
No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. You said they were in the description. They're not. So I can't verify the sources you're using. Please repeat your last question.
Why did you say that Luke and Mark were not eyewitnesses when this is common knowledge?
Because it is common knowledge. I didn't single those two out. I said none of the four authors of the Gospels were eyewitnesses, including Mark and Luke, and we know that for a fact with Mark and Luke.
But the problem is the scholarly consensus that I have provided, 23 New Testament scholars, Jefferson.
That I haven't seen yet.
23 against the two that you have provided.
You can email me that list of your scholars, you know.
Doesn't it? Do you think?
You can send me that. You can send me the list of your scholars that you've cited.
You're wasting my examination time. You're wasting my cross-examination time. How much time have I got left, Standing?
Good question. You've got 2.5 minutes.
Okay. I'll read you the following paragraph from a well-known New Testament scholar, Jefferson. So why call the books according to Matthew, according to Mark, according to Luke, and according to John? The first point to note is the obvious one. 2 of these books are assigned to disciples of Jesus and 2 to companions of the apostles who are then representatives of the apostles. Strikingly, Peter and Paul, the 2 most important figures in the early church, Mark was thought to be Peter's companion and amanuensis and secretary. Luke was Paul's traveling companion and a first-century physician, and thought by tradition to be the principal apostles precisely of Rome, where this edition was created. And so in these Gospels, we have the witnesses of Jesus's disciples and of Peter and Paul. Would you agree or disagree with that statement?
Yeah, most of that sounds right.
It sounds right.
Yeah, that sounds consistent with what I've read. I mean, the claim is being made that Mark was a companion to Peter and that Luke was a companion to Paul. There is no proof that that's the case. That's just been the traditional ascription.
You're agreeing with a New Testament scholar that the Gospels are written by Matthew, Mark, Luke,
No,
and
I'm
John.
agreeing with that New Testament scholar describing that that's the tradition. If that New Testament scholar is saying it is an actual fact that Mark, and it's a settled fact that Mark was a companion of Peter and that Luke was a companion of Paul, that has not been settled. That's just a tradition that's been going forward. So no.
Of course, it hasn't been settled. Of course.
What's the name of that particular New Testament scholar?
Dr. Bart D. Ehrman.
Okay. But you know that Bart Ehrman has gone on to write that it has not been proven that Mark was a companion to Peter.
Cross-examination? Why are you asking me questions in my cross-examination?
I'm assuming that I'm going to get some clarification questions from you.
You assume too much. You assume too much. How much time have I got left standing?
You've got 50 seconds if you wanted to maybe wrap with one final question.
I got 50 seconds. 50 seconds? My goodness. Okay. I'll finish with this. As far as texts of antiquity concerned, the Bible outstrips any other book of antiquity. Let's look at Plato and the works of Homer. There's 219 early copies of Plato. There's 2,300 early copies of Homer. There are close to 6,000 early copies, manuscript copies of the Gospels in the original Greek alone. This is an embarrassment of riches, says Dan Wallace. How long is the time gap between the event, the resurrection, and the earliest copy we have? As far as Plato is concerned, it's 1,300 years. As far as Homer is concerned, it's 400 years from the event or the original autograph and the earliest intact copy. As far as the Gospels are concerned, it is 292 years. 292 years. That's the Codex Vaticanus. How significant are the variances in the New Testament copies? They amount to 1%. 1% variance.
Gavin, if you wanted to quickly ask your question, and then what we'll do is we'll give Jefferson as much time as he needs to answer it, and then we'll quickly switch to Jefferson asking you questions for between 10 and 12 minutes. Go ahead.
So given that that scholarly consensus regarding how to determine the authenticity of an ancient document, how do you subscribe to this belief that all of the Gospels were written post 70 AD? And don't say it's a scholarly consensus, because it's not.
I don't understand what. Can you rephrase that question?
No, it's okay, because I know you're just trying to use up
No, I really don't understand what you're asking.
You do.
No, I don't. Could you ask it again or try to?
Atheist tricks. Okay, you can start your cross exam when you want.
Okay, let's do this. Let's do this, guys. Let's move into. So that was roughly closer to 12 minutes. So I'm going to give Jefferson equal time for his cross-examination. If you guys wanted to continue that specific point, maybe in the dialogue, then of course that's appropriate. So Jefferson, you now have roughly 12 minutes to cross-examine Gavin. The floor is yours.
Okay. You'd mentioned in your opening, and you'd asserted it pretty strongly, that that Matthew wrote his first gospel in Hebrew, and that was actually the first one, and then he later went on to write a Greek one. That is known as the Hebrew gospel hypothesis. Can you name any scholars that still hold to that hypothesis as being an accurate representation?
Sure. Do you want me to name them individually?
I mean, just name one or two. Is there one that's currently working today?
Yeah, they're all still alive.
Okay.
So what do you want from me? One or two?
Yeah, can you name? No, name one of the most prominent ones.
Tim McGrew, Richard Borkham.
Okay. And now you're saying that they're promoting this.
Yes, I wouldn't have listed them as references if they didn't.
Okay. Would you mind typing their names in the top chat so I can look them up later?
Yeah, I would mind because I'm on my phone. I'm not on a computer.
Well, again, when we get done with this, would you mind sending me the list of sources that you use? Because we didn't exchange them in email. I did send the two that I listed, the two sources that I listed to Standing for Truth, but I don't know. I think I actually responded that you might have gotten that, but I didn't get the 23 that you have. So if you could email those to me, I'd like to take a look at some of those scholars and read what they've written.
Sure.
Okay. No, I don't really have too much to go on. Some of the stuff that you put forward in your opening, some of it was accurate, but some of the other stuff that you'd like, the Hebrew hypothesis, I've never really gotten into that because, as far as I know, most scholars don't think that that's the case. There's nothing to indicate that Matthew would have had the training necessary in Hebrew. I mean, there's nothing indicating that Matthew was a Pharisee, a Sadducee, something like that. In fact, there's nothing to indicate that any of the apostles of Jesus would have been schooled in that way for him to write something like that in Hebrew and then have it translated into Greek later. We also don't have any copies of anything written in Aramaic, so it's there's been suggestions that could happen. Most scholars that I've read don't think that that's likely. Aramaic wouldn't have been used that way. If they were going to try to write something for circulation, it would have been written in the lingua franca, which would have been Greek. And certainly some of the Hebrew scholars, you'd mentioned this before, some of the Hebrew scholars would have brought that, would have been educated in Greek. They were probably studying the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. But do you believe that any of the apostles were educated Hebrew scholars?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay, so why do you think that they would be capable of writing compositions in Hebrew then?
What?
If you don't think that they were educated as Hebrew scholars, what makes you think they had the capacity to, like in the case of Matthew specifically, to write a composition in ancient Hebrew?
Because Matthew was written in Aramaic, and Hebrew and Aramaic are interchangeable.
Actually, there's translation issues. We don't have any evidence that any of the Gospels started out in a language other than Greek.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do.
Where is that evidence? Can you present that evidence?
I have listed the scholars.
Are you appealing to the scholarly consensus of the scholars that you've collected?
I'm appealing to the scholarly consensus that I've provided, which makes your scholarly consensus look like a small girl.
Oh, okay. And exactly how does that work? I haven't run across in any of the scholars that I've studied, any of the ones referenced in any of the works that I've got, the study Bible that I'm using, 2 of the textbooks that I'm using, none of those scholars talk about an Aramaic and Hebrew gospel hypothesis, but I haven't seen any of them actually assert that that's actually the case.
Yeah,
I think
that
I
might
found
have
one said it's a slim possibility.
that you're looking at that have got presuppositions that Jesus was not who he said he was. I think that would be accurate.
In the Oxford Study Bible, it doesn't have anything like that in there.
I think that you're reading scholarship that has an anti-theist lean. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, thanks for putting those on there, Standing for Truth. Yeah, thank you, LPP. I can see them now. They weren't there before, but I see them. All right. So, yeah, I don't really have too many more questions to ask on this. There were a couple of things that you brought up, but they'll probably come up if we start doing an open exchange. So I'll yield my time for cross-exam.
All right, guys. Perfect. Yes, both Jefferson and Gavin's references and sources should be in the description box now. Some people in the chat may have to refresh to see them at this point. So let's move into the open dialogue then, and I'll add a few minutes into the open discussion. I'll gather some questions from the audience. And yeah, let's keep it as equally timed as possible, as cordial as possible. And we'll try and focus on one topic at a time. So I guess since Jefferson just finished cross-examining Gavin, why don't we now hand it over to Gavin? If you have a couple points you want to make, or if you want to start off with a question, go ahead. However you want to proceed. The floor is yours, gentlemen.
Yeah, so the scholarly consensus is that Matthew issued his gospel originally in the Hebrew/Aramaic dialect in the 50s for the Jewish Christians in Israel, while Peter was in Rome ministering, and then later sometime in the late 50s or early 60s, he wrote his Greek version while Peter and Paul were ministering there. Do you agree or disagree with that?
I don't agree with the Hebrew gospel hypothesis. No, I think I made that pretty clear.
But then how come the scholars that I've cited support that? And it's not a hypothesis.
Are you how many of the scholars that you're citing are apologists and not capable of reading the Greek or Hebrew?
All of them.
They're all apologists.
Every one of them.
Do you know what their level of
Bible-believing Christians, Jefferson?
But do they study Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic?
Absolutely. They study everything.
Okay. So yeah, I'd have to look into their credentials. I don't know which ones that you're citing. I suspect that they are pushing a narrative that's outdated. From the scholars that I've studied, even from the ones listed in a very conservative study Bible, the Hebrew hypothesis is not something that's entertained.
Well, again, this is just highlighting your lack of scholarship. And the consensus among most scholars, not all, but most scholars, is that Matthew was written as early as 10 to 12 years after the resurrection. Those who hold to this earlier dating of Matthew believe that he first wrote his gospel in Hebrew/Aramaic. And then it was later translated into Greek. One of the evidences of this earlier dating of Matthew's gospel is that the church leaders, such as Polycarp, Irenaeus, and Origen, and Eusebius, recorded that Matthew first wrote his gospel for Jewish believers while he was still in Israel. In fact, Eusebius, who was the bishop of Caesarea and known as the father of church history, reported that Matthew wrote his gospel before he left Israel to preach the good news in other lands, which Eusebius records as happening about 12 years after the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. Some scholars believe this would place the writing of Matthew as early as 40 to 45, but no later than 55. And that is from F.F. Bruce, who is a highly regarded and respected New Testament scholar.
Okay.
So that takes care of the Hebrew Aramaic version of
It does.
Matthew.
It doesn't actually. So the consensus, the modern consensus for Matthew is that it's anonymous, and it was written in Koine Greek. And I can cite two sources for you right now for that one. One is from the Blackwell Companion, with I think his name is pronounced David Owen or Aoun. He was the editor on that, and then well, yeah, that's a pretty good one. But in general, the consensus on this is that it's no longer. This isn't something that anybody really agrees with. It's not something that you could cite as scholarly consensus. You can find scholars that disagree about lots of different things. So if you found F.F. Bruce and he's stating that, no, I think this is how it works, and it does help you get to an earlier dating of Matthew. The problem is it doesn't line up with a lot of common sense things that other scholars have put forward, that there's no way of establishing whether or not Matthew is some kind of educated Hebrew scholar capable of writing something in Aramaic or in Hebrew, given that the Gospels themselves don't describe any of Jesus's apostles as such.
Yeah, the Gospels and the Bible don't describe how educated or how literate or how illiterate the disciples were, does it?
It describes their work, and from that you can kind of extrapolate a level of education. If most of them are fishermen or laborers, they're not going to be very well lettered.
Jefferson, you can speculate. Is that right? Speculate?
Extrapolate.
No, it's called speculation.
If the Gospels describe the apostles as fishermen and laborers, this kind of thing, these are common people, then it's very likely that they were not educated or not educated highly enough to write a composition in Greek.
Really?
Or in Hebrew, or even probably even in Aramaic. And who knows whether or not Aramaic was even used for any kind of writing like this. So if Matthew is described at any point in one of the four Gospels as being some kind of man of letters, then yes, you can then extrapolate from that description. This Matthew guy was some kind of figure back then that had some kind of education. But there's nothing in the Gospels that demonstrates any of the apostles were described that way, other than being commoners.
Wow. I knew you were going to step on that landmine. Some of Jesus's disciples could probably read and write. Think about Zebedee, the father of James and John, the sons of thunder, Boanerges. Zebedee owned a fishing fleet and hired employees to work for him. That doesn't sound like he was an illiterate peasant, does it? So it's not a stretch to think his kids, James and John, could probably read and write too. Also, consider this.
How would you know that? You have to speculate that he sent them to school. It doesn't say anywhere that he did.
Speculating like you are. Also, consider this. Consider Peter, the Apostle Peter. His large home was discovered and excavated in 2011. Did you know that, Jefferson?
No, I have not heard about that.
No, you wouldn't, of course. Someone with a place as huge as this and as well appointed as this was not an illiterate peasant. What about Matthew, the tax collector? What about Matthew, the tax collector, Jefferson? Do you think he would be illiterate?
No, it depends too. I mean, I don't think literate enough to write a composition in ancient Hebrew or in Greek. That's the bar you got to hit. I'm not saying that these people can't like sign their name or jot down a couple notes or something, do something very rudimentary in that language. I'm talking about functional literacy capable of making a composition in the language that you're talking about.
Yeah. So let's think about
tax collector is not going to do you think a tax collector has the same level of education as a Hebrew scribe or scholar?
Let's talk about Matthew the tax collector. He had to be able to read since he was working with tax documents. Beyond this, he was probably bilingual since he worked with Romans and Jews from all over the diaspora.
Gavin, you seem to be you're kind of all over the place here. Being illiterate.
Be quiet. I haven't finished. Beyond this, he was probably bilingual since he worked with Romans and Jews from all over the diaspora. Not only were these disciples not illiterate peasants, but at least those who were fishermen, craftsmen, and tax collectors probably, most likely, could speak and read Greek too.
Okay, are you done? I don't want to step on your... I don't want to start talking and then find out that...
No, you can speak. Go for it.
Okay, I wasn't sure if you froze there for a second. Again, what we're talking about are levels of literacy here. Just because some of these guys probably could speak in a couple of different languages, if they knew some phrases in Greek or even knew how to kind of hold down a basic conversation in either Greek or Hebrew, then they might have been able to do that. But Aramaic was the language of this area at the time. It was what was most spoken with in terms of how they conducted things. Anything that's going to be happening in the greater part of the Greco-Roman world at this time is going to be written in Koine Greek. And anything being written about Hebrew scholarship by the scribes and scholars is going to be written in Hebrew. But, for what that's worth. But the issue here is not whether or not they were bilingual. You can be bilingual and not have the capacity to read. Do you agree with that?
Whatever. Just hurry up and finish.
Okay. Do you think have you known anyone that can speak multiple languages but cannot read or write in any of those languages?
Not that I know. Just hurry up and finish, because this is not a debate about who could speak what language. This is
no, but you keep challenging. Hang on. You keep challenging my claims or the scholarly consensus claims about literacy, and you keep getting literacy wrong. You're starting to tell me that, no, Spatchcock said that none of these people could be bilingual. I never said that. Bilingual and illiterate are not the same thing. So you need to stop equating things that don't relate. You can have bilingual, trilingual people that are incapable of writing a composition in any of those languages, or even all of those languages. That's the point that the scholars are making.
Okay. I could care less.
If you couldn't care less, why did you want to have this debate with me?
Jefferson.
You just said you couldn't care less. This is supposed to be a back and forth. Let me ask some questions. If you couldn't care less about this debate, why did you invite me to do it?
Well recognized by the majority, the consensus of scholarship. You have provided nothing but rubbish. So, can we move on to the authorship of the Gospels? The main topic of the debate.
Well, the original main topic of the debate was the dating of the Gospels. That's what you'd originally done. And then I noticed that you shifted it as time went on.
Oh, I think I can hear. Am I hearing primate whining noises?
I'm letting the audience know that you have not been honest in setting this up. You weren't even honest.
I'm not honest. Oh my goodness, I'm not honest. That's a bit rich coming from an atheist. Do you not think?
No. What does that have to do with it?
I'm gonna jump in real quick right here, guys. Let's refresh the conversation, because it's been going great so far. We've had a lively chat. You guys have kept it fun and engaging. Why don't we pick a point, any point pertaining to the bigger picture of the topic, and try and go back and forth there. If Gavin has a question, Jefferson can do his best to answer it. If Jefferson has a question for Gavin, he can do his best to answer it as well. And we'll just kind of keep it free-flowing and organic. So why don't we throw it back to, I guess, Jefferson, if you had a question or a point you wanted to make. Let's pick a topic and kind of and go with the flow. So go ahead, gentlemen.
Well, I'm happy if Gavin seems to be more comfortable, like, kind of preaching at me. So if he wants to ask questions, bring them on.
Okay, go ahead, Gavin. The floor is yours.
Okay. Why do you assume that the Gospels were written post 70 AD? And do not say that's the scholarly consensus, because it is not. It's not settled. So why do you believe the Gospels were written past 70 AD?
Because the explanations that I've read from the scholars that I have read from, including ones mentioned in a study Bible, have all consented to that kind of. Now, that doesn't mean it's scholarly consensus. Does not mean it's unanimous. It just means that the majority of New Testament scholars. I hope that you're going to be okay. You're going to give yourself a headache if you keep doing that. the majority of the scholars. You can find scholars that disagree with these dates and they'll quibble back and forth. The one thing that's part of the scholarly consensus is that the dates aren't exact, that the best that they can do is get us in a range. But the scholarly consensus is also that the authors of the gospel are not who a lot of that the church has attributed them to be, or what a lot of apologists or ministers and preachers say that they are.
So I'll repeat the question again, because suddenly you seem to have.
I was answering your question. I didn't have a question there. I was answering your question.
Oh yeah, I'll repeat it again, because for some reason you don't seem to be able to comprehend it. Why do you think, you, Jefferson Spatchcock, why do you think the Gospels were all written after AD 70? Don't mention the word scholarly consensus, or that's what the scholars say. Why do you, Jefferson Spatchcock, believe the Gospels were written after 70 AD?
Because the explanations that I've read from the scholars that I have read that cite that explain that date, that's the explanation that I agree with. That one makes sense to me. To go back further, say we want to date Matthew first, you have to end up using something like the Hebrew gospel hypothesis. And what little bit I've read on that, it just doesn't hold up. So the scholarly consensus view is the one I tend to find the most convincing. Now here's the thing: Mark may have been written a little bit earlier. The idea is that it was written around 70 CE. Could have been written 66, 67 CE, but give or take, it was probably written around that time.
Okay.
Here's another reason too. Here's the other reason. I do agree with
more. There's more.
Just let me flesh this out. I agree with Mark in priority, right? From what I've read, I think that with the way the synoptic problem has been studied, I believe that Mark came first. And the reason that I think that Mark must come first is because that author ends up describing the events of the siege of Jerusalem by Rome, and then goes on to include a prophecy from Jesus that does not come true. So when Jesus talks about, he says that there are people there listening to him that will not pass away before he returns. That's obviously false. Now there are people that do like handstands and backflips to try to say that's not what Jesus meant when he said that. He was pretty clear about the idea of the temple being destroyed, and that actually happened. So it's more plausible that the author knew about the destruction of the temple, the Roman siege of Jerusalem, and was writing around that time or shortly afterward.
Right. I shall give you the reason why atheists, anti-theists, non-believers all subscribe to the Gospels being written after AD 70. And that's simply because Jesus prophesied that the temple would be destroyed, would be leveled to the ground.
Right.
And 37 years after he said that prophecy, it happened.
But he also said he was coming back, and that didn't come true. He said he was coming back before some of the people he was talking to passed away, and they didn't pass away.
Look, Jefferson, show me a bit of respect, please, and a bit of maturity. Jesus prophesied that the temple in Mark 13, he prophesied this in Mark chapter 13, and also in Matthew, that the temple would be absolutely destroyed.
Yes,
one
I got that.
stone would not be intact upon another. That was a prophecy, and that came true. Let's say he prophesied that in say AD 33. So 43, 53, 63. 37 years later, that's what happened. The temple was leveled by the Romans. It was destroyed.
I get that, Gavin.
Being an atheist and a non-believer, of course you're going to want to date the Gospels after the destruction of the temple, because then you can say, well, whoever wrote these Gospels is just going by what happened to the temple and writing in hindsight. However, that's not what the scholars are saying, all the ones I've quoted.
So if you're a Christian, you should also want Mark to be dated around or after 70 CE, because if you don't, it means that Jesus got another prophecy wrong. It's easier to say that Mark's the addition of the facts regarding the Roman siege of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. It makes more sense that that's something the author added to it, and he got the prophecy that Jesus made this claim he was coming back. Even if you believe Jesus really is the Son of God, he says in Mark, shortly after he makes the prediction of the destruction of the temple, he says later on that he will return before many of the people that he's talking to die. He's returning within their lifetime. That doesn't come true. So if you do believe in Jesus, you should want to...
Good foxhole, Jefferson, but we're not going down that foxhole. That's a whole debate on its own for another day. But I'm talking about Jesus prophesying. Be quiet. I'm speaking about Jesus prophesying that the temple would be destroyed. And 37
I know that.
It
but if
came
you've got
true. Did it not?
Gavin, it's not. What's more likely that he makes a prophecy that comes true, but then he makes another one that demonstrably didn't happen? It's better for you to say that the author of Mark put those in there as narrative bits for describing Jesus and his ministry, rather than try to pick and choose. Well, Jesus got this prediction. I agree with you. If that's prophecy about the destruction of the temple, absolutely he got it right. But but if you're saying that Jesus is prophesying, he got that one right, but he got the other one completely wrong. And that one was about when he was coming back. That's something that he should have. He has power over.
That is a debate for another day. And I know you're just dying to go down that foxhole, but we're not going down it.
That's the extent of it. We've already done it.
No, we haven't. We haven't.
The fact that you don't realize that we have means you don't understand what I'm saying.
It's not the reason, Jefferson. It's not the reason you believe the Gospels were written after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. It's not the reason you believe the Gospels were written after that event, so that the prophesying power, or that Jesus saying that he was God, is not true. Would that be correct?
No, I'm actually saying the opposite. If we hold that Mark made that up, then the fact that Jesus gets the prophecy about his own return within the lifetimes of those listeners wrong, we can blame that on the author of Mark and not try to say Jesus got something wrong or Jesus didn't somehow have the power to fulfill one of the prophecies that he predicted.
You keep talking in circles and chasing your own tail. So just to be very
clear, I think I answered that pretty clearly.
Be quiet, be quiet. I'm talking about the prophecy Jesus made about the temple in Jerusalem, that it would be leveled, that it would be destroyed. Now, he made that prophecy 37 years before it happened. It came true, didn't it, in AD 70.
We are told in the Gospel of Mark that Jesus made that prophecy.
It came true in AD 70.
Is it a prophecy?
Did it come true?
That situation is true. Is it really prophecy? I just did. I said that is a
temple come true.
Gavin, I just answered that. Yes, that is a true scenario, but we don't have anything established that Jesus predicted it. We just have a narrative account from an author that claims Jesus predicted it, but then he also claimed Jesus predicted other things that did not come true. You are cherry picking.
Mark. We have two accounts in Matthew and Mark. Is it Mark? Yeah, Mark 13. We have
Mark
two
13,
accounts in Matthew and Mark of Jesus predicting the destruction of the temple. 37 years before it happened. Pretty spot on prophecy, would you not think?
Not if the writer just inserted it in there and claims that's what Jesus said.
But then the consensus of scholarship is that Matthew and Mark were written early, well before 70.
That is not scholarly consensus.
That is scholarly consensus. Your consensus is atheist, anti-theist nonsense.
No, it's not.
Yeah, it is. You want to play this game of ping pong all day?
Do you know what scholarly consensus is? You know it's not unanimous agreement, right?
Wow. Here we go with the Leo Phileas games. Do you know what this is? Do you not know what that is?
I'm asking that as a legitimate question. I mean, do you understand the definition of scholarly consensus?
No, you're not. No, you're not answering that as a legitimate question. You're answering that as a very dishonest question. what you're trying to do is set scenarios where you can go, aha, got you, because we know that's what atheists.
I legitimately wanted to know what you know, but if you want to impugn my motives, you're free to do that, I suppose. But you're kind of losing the debate if that's what you're doing.
I'm losing the debate. Wow. What's the chat?
Gavin, you keep making this personal. You keep talking about how I must be somehow impaired or completely dishonest because I'm an atheist. You've mentioned this several times. If you don't think that I could be an honest interlocutor, why did you invite me to a debate?
I didn't invite you.
Yes, you did.
And you're not honest. I know that for a fact in my dealings with you.
Gavin, you set this debate up. You asked. Wait a minute. You asked me to do this debate.
No, I didn't.
Yes, you did.
No, I didn't.
Okay.
Anyway,
and to anyone, praise, if you could back that up. If you would like to second Gavin there.
Shall we move on to more profitable subjects?
Well, let me jump in here real quick. Yeah, let's I'm gonna jump in. Let's make sure that we're not making things personal, of course. It's been an engaging debate. You guys are touching on a lot of good topics. Let's try and refrain from doing anything to egg each other on. I will say we do have some questions from the audience. We've been going for an hour and a half, but I don't want to just cut you guys off. If there was another point you guys wanted to respectfully discuss in order to exhaust the topic, or we can go into some uninterrupted closing statements in order to just sum up our thoughts and points for the debate. How would you guys like to proceed?
I think I'm fine with taking questions.
I bet you are. Actually, I'm not.
If you've got more questions for me, then go ahead. But a lot of people have been watching and waiting. So if we want to get to those questions, they've been patient.
Should be quiet, Jefferson. There's actually let's do this.
Okay, so on the clock, I do have another 6 minutes for dialogue. So why don't we do another 6 minutes of dialogue? Let's keep this last 6 minutes on topic, on point. Let's not do anything to egg each other on. Let's just focus on each other's points, each other's arguments, answer each other's questions as best we can. But you guys are doing a good job keeping this fun. So go ahead. We got 6 more minutes. Then we'll allow you guys to wrap it up in the form of a concluding statement. Then we'll do some questions.
In these closing minutes, Jefferson, I'm going to hold your feet to the fire about how you made the claim that none of the disciples or Jesus could speak, read, or write Greek. Now,
I didn't make that claim.
Here's a newsflash for you. 4 of Jesus's disciples had Greek names. Did you know that? Obviously not. Philip, Andrew, Peter's brother, Thaddeus, and Bartholomew are all Greek names. Why would their parents give them Greek names if Greek didn't have some kind of influence on the culture?
Gavin, are you denying? Are you denying their original names?
From living near native Greek speakers, since people called Jesus's area Galilee of the Gentiles in Matthew chapter 4, verse 15. There were probably Gentiles there interacting with Jews. Gentiles means non-Jews. You know that, eh?
Yeah.
So here's another important point. Is again, I'm holding your feet to the fire about you making the claim that Jesus could not speak Greek, or his disciples could not speak Greek. They could not read it, nor they could not write it. Nazareth was close to a major Roman trade route. A sign written in Greek called the Nazareth inscription, I bet you're Googling it right now. The Nazareth inscription was discovered here. It warns people not to rob graves in Greek. Why would it be written in Greek if people could not read Greek? But, I've just said that. So even though Nazareth was a tiny place of about 1,500 residents, it was only a few miles from a major Gentile city called Sepphoris. Jesus and his father Joseph, who was a carpenter, likely would have gone into the town of Sepphoris and interacted with Greek-speaking people while they were doing carpentry work. According to the Gospels, Jesus also ministered in Gentile places where many people spoke Greek. Places like Decapolis, Gergesea, Tyre, Sidon, and Caesarea Philippi. Even Judah had people who spoke Greek. It's not unlikely, it's not at all unlikely, that some of the disciples and Jesus himself would have known Greek as well. If at least some of the disciples knew Greek, it wouldn't be surprising to find them writing about Jesus in Greek. How do you contend with that?
Well, first of all, because you went on and on for a while there, the first thing that you brought up are the names of the apostles. The fact that they have Greek names doesn't mean that those were their only names. I'm sure you're aware of Peter's other names. Do you think that his parents named him Peter? Do you think they named him Simon, which is the Greek version of Simeon?
Do you want to get to your point?
Okay, so their name, just because they are known under Greek names, does not mean their parents were naming them after Greek people. That's a strange claim. I've never heard that before, and you'd have to do something to try to establish that that was something that was going on. Secondly, I think, well, I'll just adjust the other thing that I think that you were talking about. The idea that official signage in the Greco-Roman world, especially during this time, would be in Greek is not controversial. The fact that there are lots of people that couldn't read those signs also wouldn't be controversial. If you think a carpenter, you keep making this weird claim that I said they couldn't read, speak, or write in Greek. But that was not my claim. The claim that scholars are making has nothing to do with how many languages they could speak or what little bit of capacity they had in terms of reading and functioning in day-to-day life. The capacity for literacy to compose the Gospels is what is at question. And that's the part that scholars doubt any of the apostles that were traveling and living during Jesus' his mission, that they would have the capacity to do that. Okay, that's one.
Of your atheist scholars, Jefferson.
Look, everything that you've come back at me with is trying to say, like, look, if a carpenter comes to my place to do some work here, can I just assume that that person is literate enough to write an essay on any topic? They have the ability to sign their name. They have the ability to read and deal with signage and stuff. Do they have the ability to write a treatise about a theological matter like, the ministry of the Messiah? Those are very different things. That's the level of literacy that we're talking about. And if they really were as illiterate as some of these New Testament scholars think, they probably were just barely functioning in their own languages in those cases. There's a lot of survival techniques there.
Okay, all you're doing is validating the incoherence of the atheist worldview. Daniel Wallace said,
I don't understand how.
All the disciples were bilingual. Daniel Wallace, New Testament scholar, Jefferson knows a lot more than you. Daniel Wallace says probably all the disciples were bilingual, and probably half or more could read and write in Greek. Further, even if they didn't know Greek when they first followed Christ, he goes on to say they must have wanted to learn it for the sake of the gospel.
Right. That's
what he's talking about here is the Great Commission written about in Matthew 28, chapter 28.
I'm aware that Daniel Wallace agrees with that, but he's also kind of a fundamentalist conservative Christian. That his view is not representative of the scholarly consensus of New Testament scholars working today. It's just not.
You have no idea about scholarly consensus, and
I do. His view that he's holding to is considered kind of fringy.
You are clueless about scholarly consensus. Providing two references is abysmal. Abysmal. So, it's true that the New Testament was originally written in Greek, but just because most Jews were illiterate, it doesn't follow that many New Testament books must have been forged. Even though Jesus' disciples spoke Aramaic as their native tongue, They weren't all illiterate peasants, as you are speculating.
I didn't
At
say
least
all of them were.
would probably read or write in Greek. Thank you. I'm here till Thursday.
When did I make the claim that any of the Gospels were forged?
Do you want to go into question standing?
I just asked you a question. When did I make the claim during this debate that any of the Gospels were forged?
I'm not interested in your atheist questions.
You made the claim. You told me that I made the claim that they're forged.
No, I didn't.
Did you not?
No, I didn't.
Why did you bring up forgeries? You used the word forged. I never made a claim that I think the Gospels are forged, or that I think that the scholarly consensus that they're
Why
forged.
is my hair blonde and you are balding?
Is that relevant to what we're talking about?
Well, that's
I'm
about
gonna
as
jump in right here.
I'd
This
like
would
to-
be a good time to.
asking.
Yeah, I would like to point out that Gavin does continually make this personal. So
Oh,
Yeah,
is that primate
Yeah,
whining
let-
noise I can hear?
again,
Wine,
case
wine.
real quick,
in
guys.
point.
So let's do
Would you
this.
That wine, Jefferson. Would you like some cheese with that wine?
All right, guys. So here's what we're going to do just to make it as complete as possible, okay, in terms of the debate. Gavin started with his opening statement. So, Gavin, take a couple minutes or however long you need just to wrap everything up, sum up your points, your thoughts, okay? And then we'll hand it over to Jefferson to do the same, uninterrupted closing thoughts. And then we will jump into some questions from the audience, okay? So, Gavin, go ahead. Take a couple minutes, uninterrupted. We'll do the same for Jefferson. Floor is yours.
Okay, so this has been an appalling display from the atheist. The atheist keeps referring to the phrase scholarly consensus, and he provides two sources to look at, whereas I provided, actually it's not 23, it's 24 New Testament scholars. They do this kind of thing for a living. This is their career. It's their career. They know a lot more. What they don't know about the New Testament is not worth knowing. So I have provided an embarrassing amount of New Testament scholars, which Mr. Spatchcock can fact check afterwards, but I know he's not going to. There was multiple red herrings thrown into the debate by my opponent, which is pretty typical of atheism. I gave good scholarly consensus as to why Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written early, and that is the consensus amongst New Testament scholars, no matter what my opponent says. You've got to remember my opponent has the presupposition that God does not exist. So if God does not exist, why on earth is he struggling and grasping so hard at trying to win this debate? You'd think if something didn't exist, you wouldn't even worry about it. So anyway, I gave my reasons. What the scholars have contended are logical and plausible and probable, to quote our great friend John Maddox, as to why the Gospels were written pre-70 AD. The atheist will contend that they were written after 70 AD, because then he can claim that Jesus was not who he said he was. But we all know, everybody knows, that Christ prophesied the destruction of the temple 37 years before it occurred. That is historical fact. And you cannot argue with history, because history's happened. And the history shows that Jesus prophesied the destruction of the temple back in, say, 33, 37 years later, the temple was leveled. Now, the atheists will bring up red herrings like, well, Jesus prophesied this and it hasn't happened. Well, maybe it hasn't happened yet, right? Yet. The atheists kept doing this, going round and round in circles. I could not get a coherent and clear answer from the atheist. So I can't see the chat from here, but I think the theists have done pretty well today, and I think the atheists need a better representative if they want to be taken seriously. And so with that, I will yield my time.
Okay, I appreciate that closing statement and those final words and thoughts. So Jefferson, you get uninterrupted time. Take as much time as you need. You get the last word, and we'll jump into a Q&A from the audience. So go ahead, Jefferson. Floor is yours.
Okay. I just want to thank you again, Standing for Truth, for setting this up for us, following Gavin's challenge invitation for the debate. I think you've been a good moderator for this thing. I just wanted to use the time that I had available here to kind of run through what I've picked up studying kind of basic. Again, I've been hammering this point again and again, scholarly consensus on New Testament studies. And some of these are more conservative than our liberal ones. I am a fan of Bart Ehrman, but I don't always agree on some of the points that he makes or some of the explanations he gives. So I kind of wanted to give just a general run through of why they kind of think those dates are important. I don't think that specifically that those dates are all that important to me. They make no difference for me, and they don't bear on whether or not I believe that there is a God or that Jesus was divine, that Jesus is the only God or anything like that. I only care about like in terms of like being presented with this information, how accurate are the claims that some people are making. So when somebody's trying to tell me that the authors of the Bible were eyewitnesses, or some of them were, or if they're trying to say that they're true historical documents, they're not. They're not, and they weren't even. I don't even think they were really intended as such. They were written for the community of believers. They were written with certain ideological and theological emphasis and intentions, probably specific to their time and to the location and probably that particular type of church group that they were involved in. And as they circulated, they started getting debated and discussed and probably torn apart. They were probably pretty contentious for the Christians that could read them and could acquire them. So yeah, that's the only thing that's the only issue that I have with it. If Christians are going to come forward, theists, and specifically Christians, are going to make claims about New Testament history, the thing that I want to know is that they're getting it right. I remember Gavin got very, very irate with me back last summer when I just pointed out that it's unlikely that the Apostle Paul was able to read the four Gospels. Right. I mean, it just doesn't seem like you'd been able to, based on the dating. He certainly did. He might have been able to get a hold of like the earliest copy and read that one. And if the Hebrew hypothesis happened to be true, maybe he grabbed a copy of Matthew. But he never told anybody in the letters that are attributed to him if he read them. He would always refer to Scripture. He would refer back to the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. That's what he understood. So I think it's a really interesting bit of early church history. I think it's important for non-believers and believers to understand, because I think trying to get that, when you get that mixed message from certain church groups and they start to muddy that stuff because they think they're making the gospel sound more reliable and more convincing, they're actually not. And when people find out later on that the majority of New Testament scholars that study the languages, study the copies, they deal with the research on this, regardless of whether they're the believers or non-believers themselves. They have these debates all the time. When new believers or even old believers turn around and find this kind of stuff, they start wondering, why were they being told things different than that from their ministers and from other people of faith, people usually in authority. So I think that's important for Christians to wrestle with. As far as both groups are concerned, I think it's just important to be as accurate as possible with the most current research and data that we have, and to let the chips fall where they may. So again, thanks SFT for having me on. Thanks Gavin for the invite and for you guys getting this set up. I've had a good time, but that's it. I'm all set.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate that, Jefferson. My pleasure. My pleasure. This has been a good time. It's been engaging. Sure, it's been heated at times, but typically that's the nature of these discussions. So, we oftentimes get passionate in these debates. So overall, guys, thanks for keeping it engaging. Thanks for keeping it fun. We've had over 70 people in the chat. A lot of great questions have come in. I'm going to pick a few of them just so we kind of cap this, I would say, at the 2-hour mark. Just so people may want to head over to an after show or two. So, all right, guys, let's grab some of these questions here. I got them all saved. Let's go all the way back to the beginning here. And first question that we will go with is Daniel Marson. Thank you so much for your question there, Daniel. This was all the way back kind of near the beginning of the debate. He says, can Jefferson list some of his scholars? Which I did put all your references are in the description box, but if you wanted to respond to that, you can, Jefferson. Oh, I think you're on mute, Jefferson.
I was, for whatever reason, it wasn't opening up. Yeah, I mean, I've mentioned Bart Ehrman. There's also Raymond Brown, David Owen, Catherine Hezer, Ramsey McMullen, let's see, Robert McIver. The list goes on.
Okay, I appreciate that. We got a $4 super sticker from Mitchell. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And a question here from Andrew Kaufman. Question for Jefferson. What study Bible are your references from specifically?
And you, Standing for Truth was nice enough to put that in the description. If you don't see it, it took it a while for it to refresh for me. If you refresh the top chat, it should show up. But it's the, if you want to hear it rather than do that if you're on your phone or something, it is the New Oxford Annotated Study Bible, New Revised Standard Edition with the Apocrypha 5th edition.
Okay, I appreciate that. Okay, so question here from One Cow Stampede. Thanks for your question. Question for Jefferson. Lots of questions for you, Jefferson. So thanks for being a good sport. What do you think about Richard Friedman claiming there are no consensus in biblical scholarship? He did so in a recent attempt to distance himself from JEDP in his Exodus.
Who's JEDP?
I'm not too sure. I just read that word for word. He put that part in brackets. Maybe if you want to just.
I've heard the name. I guess it would depend. More than likely, if I had to, and I'd just be guessing here, if he's trying to contest the notion of scholarly consensus amongst New Testament scholars, I think he would have to. In his argument, I think he'd have to try to make a distinction between two different types of groups. There are apologists, and then there are sort of like the historians, and sometimes they overlap. Sometimes they're doing they have the skill set of both, and the issue ends up coming up with so. Especially if you end up seeing the experts argue with each other, are they arguing over kind of an established historic best explanation for the evidence that they have historically, or are they trying to challenge it with, from a theological perspective? If he's trying to say that, then yeah, it would be hard for anyone, especially lay people, to kind of look at that world of experts and think that they can see anything like scholarly consensus. But generally, what scholarly consensus is usually referring to in terms of New Testament scholarship is their understanding of the datings of the fragments and copies that they have, research done on the writing styles, writing types, those particular languages, especially ancient Hebrew, Koine Greek, to some extent Aramaic, even issues involving their translations and things like that. That's sort of the thing that, when you get into the kind of the nuts and bolts of when they're talking about documents, dates, date ranges, stuff like that, the majority of them kind of agree on those kinds of things. How that impacts them as Christians, believers, non-believers, or whatever is usually kept kind of personal. And if they get into those discussions, it's really no different than if you put Baptists in with a group of Catholics. You're going to see a lot of disagreement.
Okay, I appreciate that response there, Jefferson. Gavin, if you had a quick response as well, go ahead, and then we'll throw it back to Jefferson for the last word since it's his question.
Oh, what was the question? Sorry.
Oh, if you want, I could just move on to the next one, Gavin. I wasn't sure.
Yeah.
I want to keep it fair in case most of the questions are for Jefferson. So if you ever feel like you want to have some input, go ahead. And how we do it on this channel is whoever the question is for, we always give them the last word. So, okay, so here's the next question from Praise I Am. Question is to Jefferson. Have you heard of the Nazareth inscription? If so, why did you insinuate Hebrews did not write Greek? Go ahead.
Okay. I have heard of that inscription before, that particular sign. I don't really know too much about it. I didn't insinuate that all Hebrews don't know Greek. The consensus view is that the Hebrew members of the apostles were probably not lettered well enough to be able to compose in Greek. That doesn't mean that none of them couldn't speak Greek. More than likely, they probably did have the ability, that they were somewhat bilingual in it. But being a little bilingual, being completely bilingual in a language, I have many friends that I studied with that are fluent, are completely fluent in Japanese, but they are still functionally illiterate in the language. They can speak and understand it. They can carry on a conversation perfectly, but if you give them any, they don't study it scholastically. They could not write a composition in it. They can't do it. If there's enough differences in language and it's difficult enough, and you don't have the level of education there, you can have lots of examples of people being bilingual in just sort of a casual business sense, but not being capable of producing something. And really, even scholars think that a lot of the Gospels have lots of quirks to them. They don't typically think that their Greek is that sophisticated, but you still have to have a level of Greek education or to be able to try to even attempt to write something like that. So that's, if that provides clarification, hopefully that works.
Can I speak to that, Stanley?
Yeah, go ahead, Gavin.
Yeah, that's a good question. Just to speak to that word salad from Jefferson, the Nazareth inscription is a sign. It's a sign that's on a major Roman trade route, and it was discovered, and it's written in Greek, and it's a warning against people not to rob graves, and it's written in Greek. Wow,
yeah, I addressed that issue earlier.
No, you haven't. You've been dancing around the head of a pin all this debate. So
okay.
If it warns people not to rob from graves in Greek, why would it be written in Greek if the majority of people in Nazareth couldn't read Greek?
Because the authorities could.
That's your assertion. Your assertion is that the disciples and Jesus probably couldn't read Greek. That's your assertion.
My assertion was that they couldn't write it.
Wow.
Not read it, write it.
Well,
I didn't say that.
Okay, yeah, all right.
Okay, let's do this, gentlemen. Thanks for that little back and forth. Jefferson, it was your question, so you can have the last word. Then we'll move on to the next one. Go ahead.
Oh no, I'm okay. Yeah.
Okay. Awesome, guys. Here we go. Here's a question from. I'm going to put it up on screen. Jesus is Lord. Question for Jefferson, I assume. According to scholars like Jonathan Katz, Oxford Greek was the lingua franca of the Roman Empire. So Jesus most likely spoke Greek. Can you explain what lingua franca means?
Yeah, it's a commonly accepted language that basically bridges the divide between lots of different linguistic groups in order to facilitate things like trade and government. It's basically the language of business. Like English is the lingua franca today. So yeah, again, Jill is kind of running with the assumption that I said that they couldn't read it or speak it. I'm not saying that. I don't even think most of the New Testament scholars are claiming that none of these people could speak or read even some Greek. The issue is whether or not they had the literacy to write a composition in Greek.
Can I speak to that, Stanley?
Okay. Yes, go ahead, Gavin.
Yeah, look, this is ridiculous. This is really ridiculous. We're talking about Jesus Christ, who is God. God can speak Eskimo if he wants to, so he can certainly speak Greek. Let's not lose sight of that. Let's not make this all about the materialistic and naturalistic world. Let's not get sucked into that foxhole.
Right. I don't understand what you mean by that.
No, of course you wouldn't, Jefferson, but that's okay.
I'm not trying to make any kind of claim like that. I'm just making the only thing I'm doing is citing scholarly sources and explanations about literacy.
Yeah, well, your scholarly sources are nonsense. They're rubbish. And you keep doing this the whole debate. You keep doing this the whole debate.
You keep suggesting that, but a lot of the ones, for instance, one of your sources that you're citing scholarly consensus on for the earlier dating of Matthew, sort of a Hebrew thing, is or maybe it's earlier dating of Mark. Is only 3 scholars: F.F. Bruce and was it David Wallace, Daniel Wallace, and then another guy. So 3 does not. There's a lot more New Testament scholars than that.
Standing. Should I read out the scholars' names just for the audience?
Well, what you guys can do is, if you have a quick response again to that, Gavin, and then once again, this was Jefferson's question, so we'll give Jefferson the last word, and then I've got 2 more questions to get to, which will bring us to the 2-hour mark, and we'll call it a night. So go ahead, gentlemen.
I've provided sources to 24 New Testament scholars. Spatchcock has provided 2.
2 sources with lots of scholars in them. I didn't provide 2 scholars. You keep doing that, Gavin.
Yeah, and you
keep making. Okay, let's move on to this next one here. So this one is from Andrew Kaufman. Question is, believe it or not, Jefferson, it's for you again. So question, what can be said about the day of Pentecost if men were granted the ability to speak in other languages? What could be said about the ability to write in such languages? Go ahead.
Okay, yeah. I mean, if you're an historian, and how is an historian going to be able to establish that some of the apostles were given the gift of being able to compose in Hebrew and Greek? That was how the Holy Spirit moved through them. If somebody wants to make the claim, they can, but most historians are sort of like limited to being able to explain it with facts on hand. I mean, if that's true, if Jesus really was divine, and the what do they call it? Sanctification occurred, like in the book of Acts, and that transformed some of these people's minds, so they had the ability to do that. It's a possibility, but it sounds like a supernatural one, and I can't substantiate that one way or the other. It's just a claim.
Okay, I appreciate that answer. Gavin, did you have a quick response at all?
No, it's okay. It's okay, Standing.
Okay,
it's a good question. It's a good question, though.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I appreciate the answer there. So we're going to end it with this. This is a super chat that came in from Jamie Russell. I appreciate the super chat and the support, Jamie. I believe this is pertaining to a topic you guys were speaking on, maybe nearing the end of the discussion. He says, Jefferson, what did they die for? So if you remember exactly what you may have been speaking about at that time that the super chat came in, then you can respond.
Well, I assume that if he's referring to like the apostles that were later died or martyred or anything, I would answer that I would answer that question with a question: what does an Islamic jihadist die for?
So can I speak to that, Standing? Speak to that question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so Jefferson's answer is just illustrative of the weakness of his position, extremely weak. You'll notice that during this debate, I have used the scholarly method of attributions of authorship, early use in other works, and integration with other historical sources, overall consistency, and also, lastly, the fifth forensic thing that historical scholars use is any internal marks of the authenticity, e.g. the fingerprints of the author. And Jamie's question is really good. What did they die for? They died for Christ, their Savior, because they saw him alive and well 3 days after he was seriously dead. That is a historical fact that cannot be changed by this microscopic substrata of people on the planet that believe Jesus never existed, never got crucified, and never resurrected. So liars make really poor martyrs, Nobody dies for something they know to be a lie. But sometimes people will die for the truth. And with that, I yield.
All right. I appreciate that response. And Jefferson, once again, it was your question. So go ahead. You can have the last word there.
Yeah, I think that the issue here is that I'm not in any way trying to say that these people didn't sincerely believe what they were dying for. That's not you don't need to assume that they're liars and that they're going to die for a lie. They believe that that's the truth, but that doesn't mean that people don't martyr themselves for causes that turn out to be false all the time. I think the majority of Christians would think that anyone that's willing to become a suicide bomber for Allah is confused and incorrect at the very least. It's unlikely that if that person is pretending to be a Muslim, they would be willing to go to that lengths. Agreed. But the idea that people can be, convinced of something that's not there and willing to, do some very damaging things to themselves and others because of it, we have plenty of evidence that people are capable of doing that. In fact, Gavin fully believes that I'm sure he believes I'm capable of doing all sorts of horrible things because I'm confused and incorrect in my atheism. So I'll leave it at that.
All right. Well, I want to say to the audience, thanks for keeping it lively. We've had a solid audience today with lots of good questions. Thanks for the super stickers, super chats. Thank you for the debaters and their time and keeping this fun. That puts us right at the 2-hour mark. So perfect timing. Gentlemen, since you guys were the stars of the night, I'm going to hand it over to you for the last words. If you want to plug in your channels, or I believe there's at least one after show, I believe on Praise I Am's channel, if I'm correct there. So, gentlemen, thanks again for doing this debate. Thanks for keeping it fun. Good job to the both of you. So let's have some final words. Gavin, thanks for doing this. Some final thoughts.
Most welcome. Acts 16:31. Believe in the Lord Jesus Christ, and you will be saved.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Gavin, for those final words. And Jefferson, final words before we shut it down for the night?
No, other than thanks everybody for watching. Again, thanks SFT for hosting us and putting up with us. And I hope everybody is good and enjoyed something out of this. If you didn't, I'm sorry. If you did, cool.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate it. And good final words from the both of you. Yes, to the audience, I hope you guys had a good time. I hope you guys had some fun this Saturday night. I know I did. So anyways, guys, God bless. Have a good night. And SFT is out.